December 3rd marked the first day of the meeting between NATO's foreign ministers in Brussels. Ukraine's full NATO membership was one of the major points on the agenda. Ukraine is unwilling to accept, I quote, alternative surrogates or substitutes, as stated by Ukraine's foreign ministry. Is it the membership at all achievable? Would it stop Russia in its tracks or have an opposite effect? Peter Dickinson, Ukraine Alert editor from the Atlantic Council, is joining me now to try and answer these questions. Good evening and welcome to the program.
Good evening.
So as we're looking at the meeting, exactly 30 years ago, Ukraine decided to give up its nuclear arms in return for guarantees of security from such powers as the US and Russia under the so-called Budapest Memorandum. And now Ukraine seems to be using this broken promise in order to be able to gain the full NATO membership. What is the prospect of this happening, given the dynamics on the front lines and the election of Donald Trump?
Well, NATO membership has always looked like a very, very big leap for Ukraine. Before the full-scale invasion began in 2022, Ukraine had made almost no progress towards NATO membership, and it was widely understood that there was very little prospect of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. The NATO alliance had offered Ukraine some, what I would call, platitudes, comments that they would join eventually, or when they were ready, or when they met certain conditions. But essentially, there was no roadmap, and there was no commitment, and certainly no consensus on Ukraine joining. Now, has that changed since 2022? Arguably, the situation is now even more problematic. So, I think it certainly looks like a very big wish from Ukraine, a big push to try and get the NATO membership. It may, of course, be a way for Ukraine to leverage its position in negotiations by asking for full NATO membership and hoping to achieve something that is equivalent to that, something that is on that level. But I personally would say that full NATO membership at the moment looks as unlikely, or perhaps even more unlikely, than it did in 2022.
Do you think that NATO membership would actually stop Russia in its tracks? Would it change anything?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think NATO, if we look at Russia's actions in the last few decades, Putin has invaded Georgia, he's invaded Ukraine twice, he maintains soldiers in Moldova, but he's made no effort whatsoever, or he's shied away from anything that could be construed as aggression against the NATO alliance. In particular, there are 3 former Soviet republics that are part of NATO today, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the Baltics. None of them have come under threat, although, of course, Russia has historical claims to those lands, just as it has to Ukraine, or at least of a similar legitimacy in terms of its those countries' historic background in the Russian Empire. So I think if we look at what Russia does and doesn't do, they're clearly very concerned about provoking a NATO response, and they've steered clear of that. Now, the question would be how to get Ukraine into the alliance. It's something that can't happen overnight. It's an accession process. And the real danger, I think, would be that while that process were underway, Russia would look to escalate and prevent it.
So today we are taking a closer look at the NATO meeting. We are sort of commemorating the Budapest Memorandum, and we heard some time ago from President Zelensky that Ukraine may rebuild its nuclear deterrent if it wasn't allowed into NATO. How likely is that scenario to take place, and what would it mean in a long term?
Well, this has been one of Ukraine's, again, bargaining positions, as it were. President Zelensky has actually said that he said very specifically in his meeting with President-elect Donald Trump before the US election. That was in September in New York. According to Zelensky's account, he said very specifically to Trump, either we get NATO membership or we look to resume our status as a nuclear power, which Ukraine unilaterally surrendered in 1994. So this is clearly a very provocative step. Technically, the opinion is divided on whether Ukraine could realistically achieve that or not in a short space of time. I would not be surprised if it were possible. Ukraine certainly has the technological basis to do so. It has the rocket technologies, it has the nuclear technologies. It could potentially be done. It would be very difficult to do it in secret, as it were. It would be known, the process would be clear and would be discovered. So I think there would be an enormous international backlash if Ukraine went down that road. It would certainly be a last resort option. I think at this stage, it is again part of Ukraine's attempts to strengthen its bargaining position and to say to the NATO alliance, to say to NATO members, look, we appreciate that you're concerned that you don't want to get into a confrontation with Russia, but we're fighting for our lives here. If we don't have the security of NATO membership, the only other thing that really could make us secure as a country would be to be a nuclear power.
A part of this discussion when it comes to Ukraine comes from what has been called here on TVP World by some of our experts the Trump effect. And we heard from the new Secretary General of NATO who warned Donald Trump, and he said not to push Ukraine to sign a peace deal that would see the leaders of Russia and Iran high-fiving each other. And he also specifically said that this agreement would actually create, I quote, dire security threat not only to Europe, but also to the US. Do you think that Donald Trump is going to listen to his words?
Well, I think this is actually probably one of the more persuasive arguments that one could use with Donald Trump. I think if the issue were merely Ukraine's security, Ukraine's sovereignty, or Russia's ambitions in the former Soviet space, Trump would be far more relaxed about the issue and be far more ready to make compromises that perhaps he wouldn't otherwise make. But when it's placed in a broader international context, and when you bring especially China into the equation, I think you're much more likely to get Trump's attention. We have seen over the last few years how the invasion of Ukraine has created an alliance amongst the authoritarian nations of the world, leading autocratic nations. So Russia, of course, the country engaged in this invasion, but also alongside them, they forged very close ties with China. They have the backing of the Iranians. We have the North Koreans now also providing troops, ballistic missiles, artillery shells. So we have an axis of authoritarian countries forming up here, which poses a threat across the board. This is already impacting on Israel's security. There is little doubt, I think, realistically, long term, that if this axis of authoritarians continues to gain strength, then they're going to go after American interests. So in the medium to long term, there's a lot more at stake here for America than merely their status as a superpower and their credibility as a partner of Ukraine. Their own interests will will suffer if Putin is able to secure a very advantageous peace deal in Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Peter Dickinson from Ukraine Alert Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining me tonight. And so this would be all the latest news for now, but please do stay tuned here on TVP World as we will be back in just a moment with more news and features.